All right, hello everybody. Good morning. Going to get started finally. Let me introduce myself. My name is David Joseph. I am a clinical psychologist. My day job is working at the Oakland Vet Center in downtown Oakland, California. Anyone been to the Vet Center in Oakland, downtown Oakland? It's lovely. All right, great. You guys know it's lovely down there. If you guys want to come visit and you don't have a place to stay, there's some, how shall I say this, unoccupied tents just about 100 yards away. Really lovely view of City Hall there for you. Okay, so on a day-to-day basis, what I do as a psychologist at the Vet Center is I treat or provide counseling services and therapy services for combat-era veterans, veterans who served in a combat zone, or veterans who experienced military sexual trauma. Just to give you a sense of the Vet Center, if you were in a combat zone, were in combat, or experienced military sexual trauma, the way that you get to the Vet Center is you show up, you wave a copy of your exit papers, your GD-214, and that's it. You're done. You're in. We don't take money. We don't have a place for money. Don't send anyone to rob us. We don't have anything. But that's how the Vet Centers work, and that's what I do on a day-to-day basis. The vast majority of really what we're talking about then, when we're talking about the Vet Centers, we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder and some traumatic brain injury. And that's largely what I want to talk to you today about. Okay? Mental health concerns. We're going to focus in this hour on mental health concerns in the veteran community and returning veterans. And that largely means, it doesn't entirely mean, but that largely and often means post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury. Okay, so particularly we're going to focus a lot on PTSD. It's a lot in the news. It's in the news for good reason because it's a lot out there. Before I get into the presentation, let me just ask any veterans in the room. All right. Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, the real veteran. And then what's the other one? What's the other one? Oh, right, the Marines. All right, so you guys in the back, Marines, if I go too fast, find an Air Force person here, they'll explain it to you. All right, I can tell I'm going to be in trouble already. Okay. I'm also a military veteran. I served in the Israeli infantry, also when I had more hair, although not that much less, and about 30 pounds lighter. Okay, mental health challenges for veterans. What's the first thing I want you to know? And this is some research that came out in 2008, so we'll take it with a grain of sand. It's plus or minus this. Okay, this kind of research is very difficult to be exact about, but let's say the real true numbers are somewhere in this ballpark. Yes, I know. I'm sorry, guys. We're starting right in the middle here because we're skipping the whole first part of the presentation that I normally do because I only have an hour now. So we're skipping the military section. So start at where it says mental health challenges. What page is that? Anyone get there yet?
Page 16.
Page 16. And also because I have PowerPoint creep perfection disorder, I may have added 1 or 2 slides last night that are not in your presentation. My wife says it's an incurable disease. So I'm sorry about that. There aren't going to be too many that aren't in there. Mostly it's going to be in there. Okay, so these are the numbers. More or less, what we're talking about with today's veterans, OIF, why is it escaping me right now? OIF and OEF veterans, so Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom, the numbers that we're talking about, Operation New Dawn, are about almost 20% with PTSD and depression coming home. Almost 20% with a traumatic brain injury. Do you think those two overlap? Yeah, they overlap a lot. They overlap a lot. If you had an occasion wherein you might have a traumatic brain injury, might you also have had an occasion where you would walk away with PTSD if you walked away? Right? Yes. Yes. Right? So we're talking about folks sometimes, and this makes the clinical picture really complicated for the veteran and also, frankly, for the clinician. Sometimes the picture is not that simple. Is it PTSD? Yes. Is it TBI? Yes. Is it depression? Yes. Well, when I did this thing, which one was it? Yes. right? It could have been any or all of those things somehow meshed together. We can't do x-rays on people's psychological health, so we have to kind of make do with the best that we can. But what I really want you to come away with, because we're going to spend the whole hour talking about PTSD and pretty severe mental health problems, what I want you to come away with at the beginning and end of this is this next number. 70% of veterans do not have a mental health disorder, okay? So the idea, there's so much press right now about returning veterans and mental health disorders like PTSD, which is great. I think it's phenomenal that it's out there. It deserves to be out there, but it can create the impression that every returning veteran that you see is suffering from PTSD and suffering from depression and traumatic brain injury or some version of those things, and the numbers just don't bear that out. The vast majority of veterans, even those veterans who are experiencing some readjustment stress, which is really, really common, and Dr. Thomas talked a little bit about that, and we'll talk more about it. Even those veterans who are experiencing readjustment stress don't necessarily experience a difficulty or challenges to the point of a diagnosable mental health disorder. Okay, so just because you're talking to someone that's having a tough time, let's be careful not to diagnose everyone that we see. Okay, I try not to do that with my family. Sometimes I don't get away with it. So some of the transition challenges that Dr. Thomas talked about, I just want to touch on because these contribute to those mental health disorders but are also separate from them. I know I'm going a little bit out of order, I apologize. The most important one, has anyone seen The Hurt Locker? Okay, we could argue about whether that's militarily accurate and logistically accurate, and I've heard all sorts of thoughts about that. But one part that I thought was really exceptionally accurate in that movie is that he comes home from this tour in Iraq and he's walking down the aisle and he's trying to choose a cereal. And there are like 14,000 different cereals that he can choose from. And he's staring at this thing and he has no idea what to do, right? And I think he ends up just grabbing one and going, or he doesn't grab any. And I think that sense of feeling separate, of feeling like I don't belong, like what am I, this is a foreign world to me, is a really common denominator amongst veterans who are getting out of the service. Not every veteran has this. It depends what your job or MOS was. It depends where you were stationed. But I would say that most of the veterans that I talk to have at least some sense of feeling separate or different from the civilian world when they get out of the military. Managing expectations that your life will be the same as it was before, your friendships and relationships would be the same. Those things contribute to these mental health situations. We'll talk about letting down your guard, depending on where you've been, allowing yourself to trust and feel close to other people. That's an important element. Finding employment. I think it was just reported actually yesterday, the day before, unemployment for veterans. Anyone see this?
Dropped 1% from, I believe it was 12 to 11%.
I saw it as 12%, but even 12, 11%, it's not low. Okay, it's not low. So finding employment is not simple. Rebuilding community. Okay, we talked about the idea of taking off your uniform, taking off this history that you've had, and then having to create a new history and a new identity and a new community sometimes is really difficult, regardless of whether or not you're suffering from any kind of mental health disorder. The lack of daily structure, I'll talk more about. You'll hear that in the student panel later this afternoon. That's something that's commonly talked about. And then, here's another thing, particularly for those who are more in the rah-rah sections of the military, finding excitement. Civilian life can be really, really boring. Really boring. If you are used to doing some exciting, even if they're dangerous things. And so trying to find something that is exciting and interesting for our military veterans can be kind of a challenge. Did you have a question? Or want to say something?
Challenge that we're talking about, would it cause them to have an anxiety disorder that might be tied into PTSD?
The boredom?
Oh, no, the anxiety of all this transition.
No, it wouldn't cause you to have PTSD, and I'll talk really soon about what does cause you to have PTSD, but it doesn't help. It doesn't help. So what I want to get across about these ideas is that even if you don't have a mental health disorder, you're probably dealing with some version of these things. So on top of whatever mental health disorders you may have, you're also, like every returning veteran or most returning veterans, dealing with these extra stresses on you. Okay, so it's not like you come back and all you have to do is deal with this one disorder. You have to come back, deal with all of this, and deal with the consequences of these mental health situations. Okay, so just trying to, my job today actually is largely to depress the heck out of you. Okay, what I'm really trying to get across to you is how difficult this can be for veterans. And particularly when they start coming to community colleges and start coming back to school, that they're dealing with a lot, and oftentimes a lot more than we realize that they are. And oftentimes a lot more that they realize than they are. They don't see it sometimes until a little bit after. Wow, that was hard. And in some ways a lot harder than the boot camp that they went to, because in boot camp, you know what you're supposed to do at every minute. And if you're not doing it, someone corrects you, right? In all sorts of ways. Here, you have to self-correct, and there also there aren't a lot of right answers, okay? So some of the challenges that go past that are things like job loss, unemployment, depression, drugs and alcohol we're going to talk about, homelessness, violence, incarceration, suicide. It gets worse and worse and worse and worse, right, as these problems become more severe. Yes, please.
Out of that 70% that you mentioned earlier, they didn't meet diagnosis for PTSD. I'm just wondering, was there any breakdown done in terms of, I'm guessing that number means they didn't meet full criteria?
Yeah.
Or was there a breakdown of perhaps vets that may have met
Some of the criteria.
correct?
There probably is. I haven't seen that research. But yes, what you're asking is, are there people out there who don't exactly, so like on the PTSD, there's a measure for PTSD, and if you're 50 or above, we say you have, theoretically, we think you meet the criteria for PTSD. Well, what if you're 42, right? Maybe we don't say you have PTSD. If you went to the VA for benefits, you wouldn't get them based on a disability for PTSD, but you still have a 42, right? You're still having some symptoms that are causing you significant problems in life. And yes, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because we can get really hung up on the categories of diagnoses, and we don't want to do that.
Yeah,
We want to talk to people.
That's, I guess, my concern, because I think that the comment that you just made about let's not assume that they all have PTSD is definitely great, but at the same time I'm looking at the other angle of, because there's that label, then when they say, well, no, I haven't been fully diagnosed, just like other students I see with other disorders, then they feel like, well, I don't need to see anybody.
Right.
I don't need any help.
Right,
So I'm just
right.
wondering if there's anything that's, any initiatives are being done to help in that direction, because it's more about continuum rather than
Absolutely,
categorical.
absolutely. And I think that's what places like the Vet Center are for, right? You don't have to have a diagnosis in order to come. That's what college counseling centers are for. That's what resource centers are for. You don't have to necessarily meet a criteria, right? You just have to have served, right, in order to get those benefits. But I'm glad you said that. Another element that comes into play when we're talking about returning veterans that contributes to mental health disorders and contributes to the severity of them are what I would call common existential issues, particularly for those who were in combat zones and who were in combat. How can there be a higher power when the things that I saw occurred? How can there be a higher power, or the higher power that I used to believe in, when I did certain things, or I saw people I care about do certain things, or I saw all these other things happen? What we commonly see with veterans coming home is a real shift in their worldview, or a shift in their religious and view of faith. And there's an idea that, well, it's one thing to choose one, and you leave one and choose another, but I think what veterans experience oftentimes when they come home is the worldview they had when they were 18 doesn't work anymore when they're 26, particularly if they've been deployed and seen some things. And they haven't worked out yet what to replace that with. And so they come home sometimes with a bit of a void. Is this echoing too much? Okay, great. I think the last one is the one that really resonates a lot for many people, which is, I will always feel alone. No one will ever understand me. No one will ever understand what it was that I experienced. I think that sense of separateness that we talked about, that sense of being different, really is very powerful for a lot of veterans. And when they come onto campuses, they come with this wall around them of, even if I told you, you wouldn't get it. And if you didn't get it, it would actually feel worse to me, and I would feel more alone than I do now. And so oftentimes what you're dealing with veterans is this walking around in society with this sense of feeling different but looking the same. Okay? So what about PTSD? Yes? Right. And I'm glad you said that. I hear that a lot, right? That I'll talk to a guy, a student veteran, and he'll say, well, I was in the study group, but I don't trust any of them because if something were to happen, I don't know what they would do, right? And I might say, well, you were in Starbucks. What would happen, right? But in his mind, I don't know. Something could happen, and if something happens, because particularly if we're talking about PTSD, you think something really will happen, you have a hard time trusting the people around you, even with simple things, because you just don't know. Okay, and I'm going to come back much more to trust in a minute. I'm glad you talked about that. So what is PTSD? PTSD is an anxiety disorder, and I want you to remember the word anxiety, because oftentimes when we talk about PTSD, and particularly PTSD behaviors, we lose track of the anxiety. We talk a lot about anger, we talk a lot about avoidance, hiding, staying at home, things like that, and we lose track of what's behind all of that in many ways, and that's anxiety and fear. Okay? Our veterans are very good at hiding their anxiety, they're very good at hiding their fear. If you were in the armed services, you probably didn't spend a lot of time sitting around the campfire talking about your fears and anxiety. That's not really encouraged behavior. I did talk to a veteran who did that one time. Didn't go well for him, learned his lesson. Military is not the place for talking about your fears and anxiety, particularly in certain places. So we often miss this about our veterans with PTSD, that what we're seeing is actually the expression of fear and anxiety, and particularly with PTSD, that's the central point. Here are some of the things that can happen to you for you to come away with PTSD. So the idea behind PTSD is a traumatic thing happens. Okay? And when I say traumatic, I don't just mean Michigan lost to Michigan State, which for me was pretty traumatic, but with a small t, because I went to Michigan. Okay? I'm not talking about small t, I'm talking about big T trauma. Okay? Combat, childhood abuse or rape, accidents, assaults, natural disasters. And when I talk about those things, just to give you a sense, all of these things, by the way, not good for you. Not good for you physically, not good for you emotionally in general. What would you suppose is without cheating if it says on your notes, is the worst for you in terms of the most likely to predict post-traumatic stress disorder of these on the list? How many of you would say combat? Combat exposure. Okay? Childhood abuse or rape. Accidents, like car accidents, things like that. Okay? Assaults, being assaulted. Okay? And disasters. Childhood abuse or rape is the worst. So as bad as combat is for you, and it's really bad for your mental health as well as obviously your physical health, it's not as bad as childhood abuse or rape. And what that tells us, unfortunately, is that for some of our veterans, and many more than one would think, what we're actually dealing with when they come in are folks who have had childhood abuse or rape, who experienced some real challenges and difficulty in their families of origin, thought to themselves, this is a really bad place for me to be. I don't like this family. It's not working for me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to choose a better family. I'm going to choose a safer family that actually cares about me, that I can really succeed in. And so what do? They enlist. Awesome. And then we sent them to Iraq and Afghanistan over and over again. Okay, and so oftentimes what we're dealing with veterans are veterans who have had combat trauma, military sexual trauma, and have childhood trauma. That's a difficult clinical picture. That's a lot to get over. It's not always as simple as a thing happened to me when I was in the military. It's often lots of things happened to me as a kid, and then I went into the military. Now I'm in a bit of trouble. Did you have a comment? There should be. I haven't seen them. I think I could tell you just anecdotally that those numbers are, of the people that I see, those numbers are relatively high, right? It's not unusual. PTSD usually starts after the traumatic event right away and may not actually start to really show itself sometimes until months or years later. Particularly if you are in a combat zone, your PTSD often looks like the correct behavior for being in a combat zone. Okay, so if PTSD, and we'll talk about the symptoms, but if PTSD means being really, really vigilant and being really aroused and not sleeping all that much, and being kind of irritable and on guard and looking for threats all the time sounds like being a pretty good soldier, doesn't it? Okay, it works. PTSD often works really well with being in a combat zone. It's congruent with the landscape oftentimes. Not all the time, but oftentimes. And it's only for a lot of folks when they come home and then they're in a completely different scenario where it's weird to not let your kids open the windows of your house or not let them open the curtains or not let anybody play music because you don't want to give away your position in your apartment complex in a safe neighborhood. That's where PTSD starts to really get noticed oftentimes because it's not congruent with the landscape. Okay? If it lasts longer than 4 weeks, we think causes distress, that's when we can start diagnosing it as post-traumatic stress disorder. Before that, we wait and see. Now the reason for that is, okay, for most of us, like me a couple of months ago, I got into a little fender bender. Okay? I swear it was not my fault. I was not texting that time. And for the next couple of days, after I got into that car accident, I was pretty jumpy. When I got in the car, I was looking around. I was in the little suburban street, but I was driving like anything could happen anytime. I stopped texting, hands on 10 and 2, staring straight ahead. Really, my heart rate was up, my blood pressure was up. I was feeling kind of tingly. I was just kind of uncomfortable in the car. And that lasted for how long, do you think? I'm going to even give myself and say 2 or 3 days. It wasn't as bad. But like for 2 or 3 days getting in the car, I was paying a lot more attention. And then what happens after 2 or 3 days? The phone rings, I pick it up. What's going on? I look for directions while I'm driving. And I forget all of that. It goes away. My brain lets it go, the car accident. And I go back to being the same mediocre, slightly crappy driver that I was before. Okay? That's a typical response to and that's a really small trauma, okay? Nobody got hurt in this car accident. That's what's supposed to happen. After something happens, a car accident, combat, something, you're supposed to have a physiological and psychological reaction to that. It's supposed to shake you a little bit. But then what's hopefully going to happen is that after a period of time, that will recover. It'll settle down. In the case of PTSD, that never happens. It just doesn't happen. And so that feeling that I had getting in the car the day after the accident is the same feeling that I would possibly have for the next 40 years, or 50 years, or 60 years, like our World War II veterans that still come to the vet center. Okay? So the difference between PTSD and not PTSD is that all of us have some reaction to traumatic events. When you have PTSD, that reaction doesn't stop. Even when the proximity to the trauma, even when how close you are to what happened has gone away and you're in a safe place, your brain continues to believe that you are not. And that's one of the real essences of PTSD, is still feeling like the traumatic event either just happened or is about to happen or is happening right now. Any questions about that? Okay. Good news and bad news. The vast majority of people who have PTSD actually recover on their own over the course of time. And a lot of our veterans will say that. When I came home, I was a mess. I had a really tough time. I drank a lot. I was tough to be around. I didn't sleep. But 5, 6 years later, that's pretty much done. I don't really have that problem anymore. So for some people, a fair number of people, that really does get better over time. Time heals most wounds, not all. For some folks, and we're not entirely sure who that is, for some folks, it doesn't get better at all. At all, and in fact, sometimes it gets worse. Okay, so for some folks, what you come in with is what you're going to stay with 5 years, 10 years, 20, 50, same as the World War II guys. Okay? And that's really, really confusing to veterans who don't know that. It's really confusing and upsetting to their families. Right? A lot of times families say, well, he just got back from Iraq. I'll give him some time to play Call of Duty and chill out and drink some beers and do his thing or her thing. And then, it's time to go get a job and get serious about school. And the idea that 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years down the line, sometimes we're talking, some of the veterans I see were in the invasion force, right? The idea, and then they got out, the idea that this could still be bothering them sounds really crazy to the veteran and sounds really crazy to this family. Like, it's enough already. Okay, we get it. You went to Iraq. That was a while ago. Time to move on. But when it comes to PTSD, as opposed to just readjustment stress, that doesn't happen. Okay? And it's that, I think, is a huge part of the stigma of PTSD, the idea that I should have gone over this already. This should be done with already. Why is it still here? And a lot of what we do when we talk to veterans, and you have the ability to do this too, even if you're not clinicians, is to educate about PTSD, that for a fair number of people that really doesn't happen. It just doesn't go away on its own. So, what are the typical symptoms of PTSD? Well, there are a couple of different, what we would call clusters of PTSD that you should be aware of. One is, and one of the most common ones to think about, is reliving the event in some way. So there's a veteran, there's a good film about this too, but there's a veteran that was asked, well, why is it that you are still thinking about the war? The war is over. And the veteran responded, that's true. The war is over. And over, and over, and over, and over again in my mind. Okay? So the experience of PTSD for many folks, veterans and non-veterans alike, is the experience of reliving perhaps the worst events, probably the worst events of your life, the most traumatic and awful things in your life, reliving them in your mind all the time. While you're sitting listening to a lecture, while you're driving in your car, while you're listening to your wife or husband, while you're playing with your kids, whatever it is that you're doing, that doesn't go away. And oftentimes it comes back in really intrusive and powerful ways in the form, for example, of what we would call intrusive thoughts. And the key to the word intrusive thoughts is the word intrusive. Okay, so what's the difference between an intrusive thought and a memory? How many of you remember your 5th grade teacher? Come on. Okay, how many of you remember the first car you drove? Excellent. Any good ones? Toyota Corolla, yellow station wagon? Is that just me? Okay, so that's a typical memory, folks, right? That's a typical memory. I asked you to reach back into your memory database, into your long-term stored memory, pull out a memory, look at it, okay, it's right there and there, it's available to you. Before I asked you, it was in its place, it was in its file. An intrusive memory is a memory that comes up when you don't ask it to, when you are not actually looking for it. So you're driving somewhere and you're trying to figure out where you're going, and suddenly this memory of an ID exploding in Iraq comes into your mind. And it comes in a really, really vivid way, particularly if it's a flashback. Or you're playing with your kids, and the memory of children who have been hurt or killed comes into your mind, unasked for. It's the last thing that you want in your mind. And of course, that's the thing that's constantly there. And again, that's something that spouses and girlfriends and family members don't understand because they can't see it. And they say, well, they'll come into therapy and they'll say, well, how often do you think about Vietnam? Or how often do you think about the war in Iraq or Afghanistan? And the vet will say, there's never a time that I'm not thinking about it. How about now? Now. How about when we were doing this? Yes. How about yes? I'm always thinking about it, or always trying not to think about it. And the experience of, and let's just try this for a second. The one thing that I really, really do not want you to do not leave here today thinking about pink elephants. I don't want anyone here right now to imagine a pink elephant with a pink trunk and pink legs. In fact, if you think of a pink elephant, I'm going to have someone from the back come and smack you upside the head. Do not think of a pink elephant. How many of you thought of a pink elephant? Be honest. Okay? It's very difficult. The more you try not to think of something, the act of not thinking about it is in fact the act of thinking about it. It doesn't work. And so a lot of veterans with PTSD, what they're doing all the time is trying really hard not to think about the thing that they have to think about in order to not think about it. That's a lot of words, but I think you know what I mean. Okay? It's exhausting. It's exhausting. It's a huge drain on energy. It's a huge drain on memory and on your cognitive abilities. A lot of times veterans are told, well, you don't listen, or you're not paying attention, or they come in and they say, I have memory problems. And one of the reasons for that is because a huge percentage of your brain is working really hard not to think about things, to not be listening to yourself and not be paying attention, because if you were, you would be thinking about really bad and hard and difficult things. Okay? Really tough. One of the ways that this presents itself is in nightmares, in flashbacks. A flashback's a little bit different from an intrusive thought. In a flashback, you're not just remembering, you are re-experiencing. If I'm having a flashback about Iraq, I'm actually not here talking to you, I'm actually in Iraq. Flashbacks can last anywhere from, I've seen 30 seconds, 20 seconds, to a couple of minutes, 20 minutes. When you're in them, you're really transported back to this memory, and you are really not here. And to then come back and realize what just happened and where have I been is very disorienting for people. Very disorienting. And does that happen in classrooms? Yes. Does it happen walking on your campus? Yes. Does it happen anywhere? Yes. Is it predictable when it's going to happen? No. That's the problem. There are some things that we can kind of predict will trigger it. Watching war movies, for example, probably not great for flashbacks and memories. But there are other things that we can't. You're walking along your campus and you see somebody left a piece of garbage on a box or something like that. It reminds you of some strewn garbage that was in its plate. You don't even realize it reminds you of that, and boom, your mind is somewhere else. Our minds are incredibly powerful at picking on cues, oftentimes in ways that we're not aware of. And anything, and we'll get to these triggers in a second, but pretty much anything can do it. Okay? That's the bad news. If you, yes, ma'am.
Yesterday I heard the term daymares versus nightmares. What are those?
I would say a daymare is a flashback. I mean, it's not a clinical term, a daymare, but to me a daymare sounds a lot like a flashback. Or a waking dream. I mean, it's when you're kind of here but not here. Right? What can happen with flashbacks is that you can literally be in the middle of a conversation with someone and then you're not. Then you're somewhere else. It's weird for the other person. It's incredibly embarrassing for the person who's having the flashback. The last thing they want to tell you is really where they were. So they'll generally say things like, oh, I'm sorry, I was thinking about something else, or I don't know, and trying to kind of cover it. It's incredibly uncomfortable when it happens. And it brings along, this is again where education is so important, it brings, when you have flashbacks in particular, it brings along a very, very, very deep worry, if you don't know what it is. And what is that worry, do you suppose? What are people worried about if they have flashbacks? Sorry? Dying, yes, but who disappears from reality and sees and hears things that aren't there? Yes. What people think when they have flashbacks is, I am crazy. There's something wrong with me. There's something terribly wrong with me. I'm going crazy. And, this is the difficult part, and again where you all can be helpful, if I tell anyone about it, what are they going to do? They're going to lock me up. I have so many veterans come in and I ask them about flashbacks, or I ask them, do you hear or see things sometimes, or are you somewhere else? It's also common, by the way, for veterans to hear or see things in their periphery, right? That's different from, I'm not talking about a voice talking to them, that's an actual hallucination. This is more like a kind of visual disturbance of something that's just kind of over there and they turn and there's nothing, right? And I'm not entirely sure why that happens, but it's really, really common. If they tell someone about it, they think they will be locked up in a padded room because that's crazy. There's a tremendous amount of worry telling people, spouses, anyone, about what it is that they're experiencing, particularly this, right? If that was the case, that when you went out into the world, you were triggered and had flashbacks and felt really jittery and unsafe all the time, what might you not do? You might not go out into the world at all, okay? You might try to avoid anything and everything that would have you feel uncomfortable. And one of the things you're going to see in a minute is that is a lot of things. And so oftentimes, including, by the way, having intimate relationships with your spouse. And when I say intimate relationships, I'm not actually talking about sex, although also that. I'm mostly talking about talking to each other and sharing and communication and all of that gooey stuff that psychologists like me love so much. That's the kind of thing that you might really avoid because it would bring up some things. You might avoid seeing friends. You might avoid going out. You might avoid driving anywhere in the Bay Area, for example. Okay, those are things that you might avoid. Well, if you're going to avoid all those things, what does your life look like? Really, really, really small. Okay, and what veterans find sometimes is that their lives become incredibly isolated and incredibly small and more narrow as things get worse for them or as things become more and more stressful. And oftentimes, if they are able to come to school, their life literally revolves around school, home. If I'm not in I don't do environments other than school and home. I go to a class, I know exactly where I sit in the same spot. When class is over, I'm in my car, I don't stop for anything, I don't talk to anybody, I'm back home. Not very fulfilling for just about anyone, not fulfilling for veterans. Again, and we'll talk more about this in the second hour, there are opportunities here sometimes to help veterans reintegrate and engage more in ways that are safer and fulfilling to them, because if not, their lives can continue to be smaller and smaller and smaller, and then we're talking about a pretty good reason to feel depressed. And some other things happen too when that happens. So, yes?
Did they ever get agoraphobic, like where they don't want to leave the house?
Yes, they get agoraphobic when they don't want to leave the house, and I'll get to that in just a second. Yeah.
Can you say more about how you distinguish between hallucinations of this peripheral hearing or...
So the question about when's it a hallucination and when's it a peripheral, when's it a flashback? Actually, the literature is really bad about that. So in PTSD, we say you have a flashback, which is really actually seeing and hearing things that aren't there. We don't call that a hallucination. It's similar to a hallucination in the sense that you are disconnecting from the reality that you're in. I would say that the difference, if I were to split hairs, the real difference is that a flashback, you are flashing, it's a memory. It's a memory that's being relived, as opposed to hallucination, which is something that didn't happen but is being created on the spot.
I'm aware of that. I guess what I was wondering, so you mentioned that sometimes you'll be walking and there'll be something peripheral, and I wasn't sure if you meant something that happened before, or that
No, usually no. And again, it's tough to, I'm not exactly sure even how to answer it. Usually what veterans will talk about is literally just seeing like a shadow. They don't actually see a thing. They'll see just some kind of light flickering something, and they'll turn to look at what it is, and it's nothing. It's not like they turn and then there's a guy that says, hey, what's up? And then it's not real, right? It can be auditory too, and if it's auditory, it's usually in the form of kind of like little whispers, not audible words. It's just like a little disturbance as opposed to an actual thing that they see and hear, if that makes sense. And that's really worrisome also when that happens. Along with all of those symptoms is the experience of feeling numb. Why would you suppose a veteran with PTSD, they're having all these symptoms, why would they feel numb? What's the purpose of that? There's a real psychological purpose of feeling numb. Protection, yes. It is the protection of not feeling bad. So one of the things that veterans do, and it's not really usually thought out, it's just the result of having all this stuff on your mind, is they tune all of it out. They bury it, they lock it in a closet, they stick it in a safe, they throw that under the bed, then they take the bed and they bury it as far as they possibly can, and along with that, pretty much every other emotion that they have except sometimes anger. That one seems to find its way out oftentimes. And so oftentimes the experience of a veteran is, I just don't feel anything. My cousin died, nothing. This happened in my life, nothing. I don't care. What I often hear from veterans, particularly with PTSD, is, I'm not going to kill myself, but if I got hit by a bus, I just don't care. Because I just can't access any of those feelings. If I access them, all these other bad feelings would come out. I don't want that, so it's all buried. It's better this way. It's much safer for me. Let's just keep it all locked up, and I'll just go through life in this kind of numb way. Well, what's the problem with that? Sounds like a reasonable solution. You don't want to feel bad, so you kind of numb it. What's the problem? Anyone think it's a problem? Okay, exactly. How does that work? I don't know how your spouses are. How does that work in relationships? I'm going to generalize and say very poorly. Okay, it works really poorly. Usually when you're in a relationship with someone, they expect you to be something other than numb with them. They expect some emotion to come from you. okay? And so relationships tend to go really poorly because all the other person can get out of you is numb, is flat, is wall. I am behind the wall. You are over there. I can't really hear you and touch you and see you because you're over there. So the very thing that actually would help, which is engaging and connecting and being attached to someone, are the things that are so hard to do because you are avoiding all of your feelings and living behind this wall, okay? And so part of what's so really difficult about PTSD is that many of the symptoms of PTSD, avoidance for one, and feeling numb, reinforce continuing to have PTSD. So the very thing that you need to do is the opposite of what the symptoms are. And so what's so difficult about therapy for PTSD is you're actually getting people to do the very thing, the very, very last thing that they actually want to do, the most uncomfortable thing, which is to talk about their memories, talk about their feelings, and re-engage with people. Okay? Now, for those people who aren't really, really, really full-blown, like you were talking about, people who are in the middle, there's often a lot of wiggle room to help people do that. I'm not the only one, as a psychologist, that can help folks engage and feel less numb and kind of come out of their shell a little bit and start to trust in small ways. You all can do that too, and can help them do that too when there's some wiggle room. Okay, so there's definite room for encouragement here of helping veterans step out a little bit and feel safe in new ways. All right, yeah.
I got a question. And you're doing a great job, but what I don't understand, you got educators that are sending veterans to the VA.
Yes.
Well, the problem is the feedback comes back is they're not getting help because they can't get into the VA system. So in reality, the message is two messages are being sent. They just felt like no one cares about them again. And to the staff, you're going, how did it turn out? I wasn't seen, blah, blah, blah. It created more difficulty. And that's really a big problem I see with the VA when it comes to PTSD is these students not getting in when they need help. Besides emergency, they're not going to do that because I got a mental health problem. They don't do that. So I see that as a big, big problem.
I want to respond to that. There's a hand raised in the back, and then I'll come back to what you said, because
The other comment that I'm concerned as well is that I'm seeing when they do see the DA, and PTSD actually case as well, is our students are coming in so drugged up because they're using a drug to resolve a drug to sleep, a drug to make them, hyper, a drug to so they're
not to mention the drugs to deal with their chronic pain. Yeah.
yeah. There is so much pain physically, also as emotionally, and they're trying to study that to go ahead and we put them in our PSPS program. But even then, they really still need that one-on-one with our veterans, with one counselor. And I have Marine Corps and Army, and I am also a Purple Heart mom. My son is a Marine Corps and Veterans in the Navy, both in the Marine Corps. And it's so different because my Navy is already a senior PTSD, and my Marine Corps has been already 6 years. And still, what they're doing to them with PTSD and PTSD and stress on the back of the head, as well as some other Marines that I have, in my state. They're giving so much stress, they're coming to school with, one minute they're high, one minute they're low, and not high, but like, it's the good to help them even get out of bed. How do we deal with that? Me as a faculty member as well.
I think that those are they're similar points, and so let me address them. Partly by saying, even though I'm being videotaped and I work for the Department of Veteran Affairs, I can't really disagree with what you're saying, right? I think that it's not unusual to hear people have not great experiences at the VA for all sorts of reasons. Some of that has to do with the fault of the VA, and some of that has to do with the funding, and some of that has to do with the people at the VA. There are a million reasons, and I know most of them because I work at a vet center, which is not exactly the VA, and actually at the vet centers, we do provide one-on-one individual treatment, and if somebody calls and wants to be a new client, we call them back in 48 hours, or at least we're supposed to. I can't guarantee that it happens, and you should get individual care. But I agree with what you're saying. The VA system, it's a huge bureaucracy. I thought that image from the last session of being crunched between bureaucracies is really true. I think that one of the ways that we can help vets is to encourage them to get what they need from the VA in an assertive way. If they don't like their doctor, to try to get another one. If they think they're being over-medicated, to try to talk to their doctor and advocate for themselves. I think it's really difficult to do. There are some doctors at the VA who that doesn't work with, but there are a lot that you can if you advocate for yourself. A lot of times I'll talk to veterans who went to the local VA and they've had a bad experience, and I'll talk to the clinician or I'll talk to the person, and their version of what happens is different. And I'm not saying that the vet's not telling the truth. I'm saying that you come into the VA, it's this huge bureaucracy, just like the school system is. It's hard to navigate, and sometimes it's difficult to see it all through. So sometimes in order to see the person that you need to see, you have to tell your story, the same story, 5 times to 5 different people until you get to where you need to go. Usually, in my experience, eventually you will get there, just like with VA disability claims. Eventually, a year or 2 later, you'll get it. But you have to have a certain perseverance, okay? And so I'm not discounting anything that you say. I think that it is oftentimes a big problem. I think the VAs largely were not prepared for all of the veterans that have come back. I think they had just found a way to actually really be better with the Vietnam veterans that they were dealing with. And suddenly we had this huge influx with all these veterans coming back, and they just have been scrambling to keep up. Sometimes they're more successful at it than others. Sometimes it's really tough because people are hard to treat also. Sometimes the VA will offer services. We say, well, if you do this, we think this will work, and the person doesn't want to do that because it's uncomfortable, or they go to school, or they have a job, or all 3, they don't have time. The VA is usually open from 8 to 4:30. When do most people work? 8 to 4:30. When do most people go to school? 8 to 4:30. So sometimes actually going to the groups that the VA provides is really tough. You have to miss class, so on and so forth. There are a ton of, I appreciate that you said that, there are a ton of challenges. I wish that I was king of the VA and could fix them, except that I agree with you that what I would suggest in terms of a recommendation is to encourage people to go back and change and be assertive and be attentive so that they can force the VA to help them, in a sense. Force the folks who are really the right people to see to do their jobs well. Sometimes that will work. Other times it won't. Yeah.
One of the things that always astounds me about working with veterans is that we keep telling them they have to advocate for themselves, and yet when you work in a community college, you know that if you become a mentor, we don't ask them to always have to learn to be the advocate for themselves. We are kind of always asking them to figure it out. What do you need done? Go back and fight for yourself, and yet we're talking about mentor issues that aren't real good for doing that very thing. Just because they could
Yes.
when they were in the service, they can't now, and there seems to be a great disconnect between educators and the VA, and that advocate for yourself, and they're not doing
Well, and I'm suggesting helping them do that.
Yeah.
I'm suggesting helping them do that. If the meds that a lot of times veterans they'll go to a psychiatrist, and what is the job of the psychiatrist usually? Like, what's their tool? What tool do they have? Medication. They don't have other tools. That's the tool that they have. So guess what you get when you go to the psychiatrist? You get medication, because that's what they do. Okay, that's not a bad thing, but sometimes the vet doesn't realize, and Dr. Thomas talked about hierarchy, that if the medication that you're taking is really, really not working, you don't have to wait 3 months for your next appointment to tell the psychiatrist that. You can go back in and you can be assertive about that and say, you told me to try it for 3 weeks, I tried it for 3 weeks, this is a disaster, it's making it worse, or I can't function, or whatever it is, I'd like you to try something else, right? But they don't always know that they can do that. And it is important to kind of push them help them in the direction of, well, when's your next appointment? Well, my next appointment's not till March. Well, let's not wait till March. Why don't you call them up today and Dr. So-and-so, or sometimes they have walk-ins. Oftentimes they'll have a day where you can just kind of come in and walk in. Why don't you go to a walk-in and tell them that it's time for something else, right? And it doesn't occur to them because they're talking to this guy with a bunch of letters after his or her name, and they're not used to being able to have those conversations with them. And so they get so frustrated, because there's a lot that is frustrating, that they say, well, forget it. And they stop taking the meds, and they go and they find some pot, and they deal, or alcohol, and they deal with it that way, and there are other ways to do it. And again, I'm not suggesting that this is an easy process or one without flaws, but hopefully there's some way that we can help them. And then I do want to get back to the actual
Well, I will
thing.
agree that the VA is improving case management, particularly in terms of like OES, transition programs. Maybe with the VA vet centers, it's a little bit different apparatus as a VA name. I have never been able to walk into a VA regional hospital facility outpatient clinic and get a walk-in counseling appointment. Moreover, I've actually went to appointments I've had scheduled driving on the way to Long Beach Hospital and got a call from the counseling staff canceling my appointment. Why? Because it's public sector. You can do that. It's private sector. If you're held to a market standard, you couldn't get away with that as a practicing clinician because you're under a different set of standards, as we know from the private practice to the VA government apparatus. So I've never had that experience, and I've been out since 2006.
And I believe you. I believe you. And so all I can say to the issues around the VA is yes, yes, yes. It's a problem. They're all problems, guys. I know it. I don't have great solutions for it. It's a huge bureaucracy. A lot of times it really depends on which clinic you're going to and who's in charge of it and which clinician you get to see. I wish there was a better answer for you than that. There just isn't. I agree, it hugely contributes to the stress of veterans who are trying to get help. There's nothing worse than going to a clinic and going through all these forms and filling out all this stuff, and you say, okay, I'm here to get help, and then you get a cancellation at the last second. And now you have to wait another 3 months, or the next appointment they schedule for you is when you got a test. I get that. It's a huge problem. I don't know what to tell you except that you all have to help veterans deal with that, right? Well, hold on. I'm gonna stop. Guys, I'm gonna stop. I'm happy to talk about this afterwards. We could go on talking about the VA and all the problems that the VA has for hours. Because I'm being videotaped, I'd probably be fired. But the truth is that, yes, it's a big bureaucracy that has not worked itself out yet. It doesn't help to say that it's better than it used to be. It is better than it used to be. It's continuing to get better than it used to be. But for a lot of veterans, it's not a great experience. I would also argue, by the way, that depending on the clinic, particularly for women veterans, it is a really unfriendly and unsafe place, or it feels unsafe to a lot of women veterans. The VA doesn't provide groups for women because they may not have enough folks. The waiting room is filled with a bunch of dudes, right, who are in some form or another of their own mental health issues. It's not necessarily a welcome place. So I agree, to just send someone to the VA or just send someone to the vet center and say, okay, I did my referral, they're good now, probably or possibly will not work. Okay? I agree.
30 seconds, please.
Well,
This is not a problem. This is a solution. If we're going to have veterans resource centers, part of our whole Vets on Deck is to be a resource center. So a stopgap when the VA can't help. There's over 700 therapists that volunteer their time in Southern California. There are advocates out there. We can make referrals. We don't have to be frustrated until the VA becomes perfect.
Yeah, because and I want to add to that, I'm really glad you said that, because one thing that you can do, particularly those of you who are counselors, is try to, if you can, learn the names of actual VA employees who you've heard good things about. Okay, if you can do that, instead of sending someone over to the building, have a VA clinician, have a VA case manager that you know who is reliable, who knows what they're talking about, who you've heard good things about, and call them up personally and say, I get this all the time. They don't just refer to the vet center. If somebody knows me, I'll get a call. Sometimes I get a call from Oakland Police because they know me. We have a veteran. Can he come see you personally? If you can do that with your VA folks, if you can do that with your vet center folks, if there is that possibility, that makes the bureaucracy a little bit less, right? If you're having these personal relationships, the VA clinicians, most of them are people too, okay? So that's one avenue where there might be some improvement. I got to go back into this because it's almost going to be time to move.
15 minutes.
Right, so I'm going to talk fast, folks. Feeling keyed up or overwhelmed is a huge element of PTSD. Suddenly being very angry or irritable. Sleep problems. Your average veteran with PTSD sleeps how many hours a night would you guess? 3 to 4. Okay, that's the experience that I get, and it's not very restful 3 to 4. I don't know how you guys are on 3 to 4 hours of sleep every day. I'm pretty crabby. Okay, so a lot of what we're talking about with PTSD is just folks who don't, in addition to all this other stuff, folks who do not sleep well and are having memory problems and mood problems and all sorts of physical pain, largely because they're not sleeping. And the VA gives them a lot of medications to try to help them sleep. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work. It's just the way that it goes. So concentration, feeling always on guard. If they're sitting in a class, if they're on campus, if they are anywhere, they are on guard. If they're walking from the BART, the public transit in Oakland, to my office, what are they doing on the way? Boo. They are checking around every corner. They are checking rooftops for snipers. They are checking everyone that's behind them. As any man or woman walks past them, they are doing a threat assessment. What is this person going to do? If they act, what will I do in response? Every person that they encounter that could be a potential threat, there's some formulation of what they will do in response. All the time. If they go to the supermarket, they try to go, if they realize, they try to go during off hours. If they go to school and go to classes, they try to go when there aren't a lot of crowds. They try not to sit. If they sit in your classroom, where do they sit? Of course, as Dr. Stans was saying, largely in the back. Why? Because you can leave. Because you know where your exits are. Okay? So always feeling on guard, very easily startled by noises, surprises. For example, if I was sitting in the back of this classroom and somebody suddenly opened the back door, my adrenaline, if I had PTSD, I would first of all look, and my adrenaline would shoot up for about 10 or 15 minutes, just from that. All the rest of us would just be paying attention to this fascinating lecture, and the vet with PTSD might jump, may not show it, but might jump and is going to be jumpy for a little while. Okay, just from the opening of the door. I definitely don't recommend walking up to a veteran from behind and smacking him on the back. You could try that. I think you will have the experience of being punched, probably. Not a good idea. That startle response is really, really, really powerful. Okay. Ways to think about PTSD that we've talked about so far. 1, PTSD is a fear and safety disorder. The experience of having PTSD is of feeling fearful, of having anxiety, and feeling unsafe, even in places that are really, really safe. Okay, so I talked to a recently returned veteran. He got back from Iraq about 10 months ago. He was a gunner on convoys. That's all he did, was be a gunner. He comes back to a local suburb of the Bay Area, and he will not go to the park with his family. Why not? He might be attacked by insurgents there. Too much to pay attention to. So I say to him, this is not a dumb guy. I say to him, well, what do you think, when was the last time you read in the newspaper that an insurgent attacked someone in the Bay Area? Well, I haven't read that. So what do you think the chances are if you actually went to a park that an insurgent would do something to you or your family? Oh, he says, well, now that I think about it, he said, only about 50%. Are you with me? Would you go to the park if there was a 50% chance that someone would try to hurt you and your family? Hell no. Okay, and so that's the feeling that he has. He won't wear headphones because then he can't hear. He won't let the TV be on loud because then he can't hear. When his kids are playing, he yells and makes them be quiet because then he can't hear his surroundings. And he can't know what's about to happen, even though in the complex where he lives, nothing ever happens. Has anything ever happened there? No, but something could. And the experience of PTSD is the feeling that something is about to happen. Okay? PTSD is a brain disorder. The limbic system of our brain, the fight or flight system of our brain, is radically changed with PTSD. You are always in a fight or flight mode, even when there's nothing really to fight or flee from. That's the experience of PTSD. It's a trust disorder, as you were saying. It makes trusting yourself, trusting other people, really, really, really difficult, even though in some sense that's what would be helpful. It's a thought disorder in the sense that your thinking is often changed. Your idea about safety changes. Your idea about other people changes. That's part of PTSD. And it's a disorder of the soul, is one way that people talk about it. That you feel radically different on the inside, less at peace, when you have PTSD. I'm going to go kind of fast because of the time. Who gets PTSD? Yeah, you know the saying, that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger? Have you heard that saying? Okay, thank you, Nietzsche. When it comes to PTSD, it's all crap. It's not true. Okay, that which doesn't kill you in the case of trauma makes you more susceptible to getting PTSD later. Okay, so good kinds of stress are things like boot camp. I go to boot camp. I'm really scared. I don't think I can do it. Oh my God, this is so hard. Whoa, I did it. That's so great. I really became stronger as a result of this really tough thing. That's not trauma, although boot camp can be traumatic for some people. Trauma is something a lot more severe than that. And what it does is it causes cracks in the system. And so if you've had previous trauma, particularly if you were younger, it makes it more likely that the next thing that will happen will not just be a crack but a break. So the more you have, the more likely it is that the next thing or that thing is going to cause real problems. Yeah?
What would you put the proximity on that? Meaning is the proximity meaning time when it occurred, but also actual location to trauma versus different type of trauma if you're getting through direct mortar fire, you're not seeing the enemy, versus if you're doing mountain house to house, room to room, and your eyeball to eyeball.
I would say, instead of the word proximity, I would say danger, right? I mean, in addition to proximity, the issue isn't, because you could be in a place where there's a ton of mortar fire coming at you and the chances of being killed are really high. So it mostly has to do with imminence of danger and a sense of how likely is it that something bad is really going to happen, but also how frightening it is. So, you know, some folks will say, it really is also very subjective. Some people will say, you know, what really scared me was this one day where I saw this boy and he ran up to the Humvee in our convoy, and I thought maybe I should shoot him, but I didn't shoot him. But then everybody got really angry with me because I didn't shoot him. I've heard that before, because he could have had explosives. That moment of being afraid of, oh my God, what's going to happen, could for someone be much worse than some other things that objectively were actually much scarier. A lot of it has to do with how you interpret in the moment of what's scary. Like, objectively, house-to-house clearings, yeah. The guys who did a lot more of those are more likely to have PTSD, because for most folks, that's really scary. People who were on a base in the green zone or somewhere, and there was mortar fire here and there, they are less likely to come away with PTSD. But if one landed really close to them while they were sleeping, then maybe they're more likely, you see what I mean? It really depends on how you interpret and also what you've had in the past. So some veterans, for example, we have a number of veterans who are not American-born and who come into the service and don't speak very good English. And so the trauma that they experience is being scared, but also not knowing what the hell's going on while it's happening. That adds to being scared. Okay, so it can be really subjective. What can be a trigger? Driving in the Bay Area. Driving is a huge trigger for folks. So veterans may not want to come to your class if it's being offered at a time where they have to drive there during rush hour or drive home during rush hour. That could be really difficult for them. And if they tell you, well, I don't like to drive during rush hour, what they might be saying to you is, when I drive during rush hour, I feel like my head's going to explode. I get so mad and so frustrated and so anxious that I can't really concentrate in your class. Okay? So it's not just, I don't like being in traffic. None of us likes being in traffic. When you have PTSD, driving is incredibly stressful, particularly those people who were in Iraq, Afghanistan, and are used to paying incredible attention to things on the sides of the roads and possible IDs and possible conflicts. Driving from here to there can be a really, really tough thing. Okay, so be aware of that. Smells. Smells can be incredible triggers. Are smells really highly related to memory? When it comes to military sexual trauma, for example, the smell of cologne, the smell of something that's familiar to the traumatic event could easily trigger you. You could be in a really safe place. It doesn't matter. Okay? The smell of diesel, that's a pretty obvious one, but it could be things that are much more benign than that and much more subtle. Okay? Sounds, helicopters, ambulances, babies crying, you name it. Any sound that associates with a traumatic event or associates with a place that was associated with a traumatic event can bring you back into that place. Anniversary dates. What am I talking about when I say anniversary dates? Alive days. Yeah. I'm not talking about we got engaged on this day. More like there was an engagement on that day. Okay, something happened, a bad day happened. And so one of the things that you'll see sometimes on campuses is you'll have a veteran that comes every day faithfully, they're always there, they do all their assignments, and then for a week they're gone. Gone. You won't see them. Maybe 2 weeks. And you can't figure it out. What happened? Why were they gone for 2 weeks? They're clearly motivated to be in this class. And they come back and they say, well, I couldn't be here for 2 weeks. I was having a tough time. Okay? Some professors will say, well, too bad. You missed whatever you missed. You missed too many absences. And that's certainly the prerogative of professors. It's prerogative of the school to do that. I would suggest that some flexibility is possible here too. Anniversary dates. Most veterans that I talk to, if something bad happened to them or something bad happened to someone close to them, they know exactly where and they know exactly when. And no matter how many years have gone by, that date doesn't change in their minds. It's also a date oftentimes where you will hear from family members and friends. So a veteran that I talk to every year on the anniversary of the death of some of his friends, all of their parents called him because he was a medic and he helped them. Right? So for him, every year he misses about 2 weeks of school. Sometimes he fails those classes and has to make them up because he doesn't want to leave his house on those days. Those are the conversations you might be able to have with veterans. Television, movies, playing movies and watching TV in class while being an excellent distraction from planning a lesson. Just be really aware. It doesn't have to be about the military for it to be distressing. Any thoughts about this? Beach, probably in Hawaii. What could be a trigger here? You said it. You have to say it aloud now. The sand. Anyone been to the Middle East? Did you notice that there was sand there? There's a lot of sand in the Middle East. Okay, so one, it could be sand. It could also be the experience of having a really good day. That's the trick of it. Okay, you can be walking along the beach, you're holding the hand of the person that you love, you're suddenly having this really good day, and the experience of being happy triggers the experience of not being happy. Does that make sense? It actually, I'm so happy, this is so much better than, boom, you're back. Okay? And so, again, the difficulty of PTSD is that even in your good moments, even your good moments can turn very quickly into bad moments.
And aren't most R&Rs like Hawaii or Australia, and then you can have the beaches there?
That's possible too. That's possible too. So really, really tricky here. I'm going to talk about substance use, and then we're going to stop. Okay, and we'll pick up after in the second part. Okay, we're going to 11:15, right?
You got some more time. Lunch doesn't start till 11:30.
Oh my God. Okay, I'll take a couple more minutes then. PTSD and substance use. We talked about feeling numb. What is a really good way to do that? Drink. And drink and drink and drink some more. Not just drinking, but oftentimes drinking. Why in particular drinking, do you think? Yes, sir.
First, you went on the entire deployment without drinking.
Right.
The culture that is really big on binge drinking and drinking. So once you get back, you're drinking for lost time. But later, through medicated tools, that becomes a downward spiral.
So would you say that drinking and drinking heavily is socially acceptable in the military on your off hours?
My experience of being in the Marine Corps in our subculture of the military, very much so.
Very much so. Okay, so number one, it's part of the culture in a lot of places. Drinking is fine. Okay, you come back from deployment. Most, particularly Marines and Army who were in real combat zones will tell you, what's the first thing I did? I drank. And then what's the second thing I did? I drank. Right? Because that's what you do. It's part of the culture. It's not necessarily in and of itself a bad thing. What happens for folks with PTSD is that drinking serves some other purposes, some really powerful purposes. If you really want to numb out, if you drink enough, you will numb out. If you really want to sleep, I guarantee you if you drink enough alcohol, take enough drugs, you will sleep. Okay? If you drink a bottle of vodka, you will sleep. What will you also not do if you drink a lot? Something that veterans hate about sleeping. What comes with sleeping? Nightmares. If you drink enough, you will sleep and you will not have nightmares. Sounds like a good deal, right? What's the problem? First of all, drinking will make you sleep. It will not make you rest. So we know that alcohol actually destroys rest even while your body is actually sleeping. So it's not like you wake up the next morning and you go, oh, I'm ready for the day. No. Okay, so number one, it doesn't actually help you get any more rest. What else does it do?
Groundhog Day would be the same thing.
Sorry?
Experiences Groundhog Day, meaning it's going to be repetitive.
Yeah, what happens the next day? Is your PTSD cured? No. So you have to do it again, and you have to do it again. And then while you're doing that, you're building up tolerance for alcohol. So you have to drink more, and you have to do something else. And pretty soon what you've got is a situation where the only way that you have now taught yourself to feel any good and sleep and numb out and isolate is drinking. And so that's why 3 times greater, your chances of having a substance disorder are 3 times greater if you have PTSD, because in the very, very short term, substance use is an excellent tool for managing PTSD. Really good. In the long term, it's a total disaster. Absolute disaster. It wrecks families and wrecks relationships and wrecks academic careers and does all those things in the service of trying to manage PTSD symptoms. Why I think it's important, again, for you all to know about this is that, hold on a second. One of the things that I think is important to know is there's a tremendous stigma about alcohol and substance use. And I think if you encounter veterans that are struggling with that, they may not have been, what they may have been told is, well, you've got to stop drinking, and they know this. What happens, by the way, when they stop drinking? What happens to their PTSD? Comes right back up. Okay, you think it's gone, it's not gone. It comes right back up in full force. And so, what do you do in response to that? Because you don't know how to handle those feelings. You drink again. It makes it very difficult to stop drinking. And so again, that's where encouragement to deal with both PTSD and both substance use at the same time is a good thing. Okay? The VA has finally learned, not every VA does this, they're supposed to do this. It used to be at the VA that they wouldn't treat your PTSD until your substance use was under control. And they would say, well, get sober for 90 days or get sober for 6 months and then we'll talk about PTSD. Officially, the VA is not allowed to do that anymore. They're actually not allowed to. It's new regulations. Are there VAs who still do that? Yes. I don't know what they do down here where we are. That's not how they handle it because they're not supposed to. Theoretically, you should be dealing with both at the same time. That's what we want to do. I'll do this next part and then really I will let you go. PTSD's couples and families. This will be shocking and surprising to you all. Vets have trouble letting someone close to them. They often feel trapped. On the one hand, they really, really want the people around them to understand what they're going through, to understand what they went through, to understand their symptoms. On the other hand, there's a tremendous worry that A, someone will think they're crazy, B, someone will think that they are whining or complaining, and C, that the person flat out will just not understand and think they're weak. And so there's a huge amount of pressure. Well, if I, particularly for men, if I'm the man, I cannot tell you about these things because then you will see me as weak, you won't respect me, my friends won't, family won't respect me, I can't be the man that I'm supposed to be if I actually tell you that this is what I'm experiencing. And also, I don't think you will have any clue what I'm talking about and are very likely to blow it off in some way that will make me feel worse. Now, is that actually true? Will that actually happen? Sometimes. I think we shouldn't be under the illusion that telling your spouse always works. I've definitely had spouses come in and I'll do the whole dog and pony show and I teach them all about PTSD and I'm waiting for the spouse to say, oh my God, I didn't realize that's what you're going through. And what I get is, so when can you get a job? So what are you saying? Right? It's not always what you want. And there's some reason for that too. If you've been deployed a lot, sometimes the spouse is waiting for you to come back because they have been doing all sorts of stuff in your absence.